Hello humans, Valence Realists, Yellow Painters, Techno-Buddhists, and Alpha Wave Coherence Evangelists. This is Ryan Ferris. Welcome to The Good Timeline. The Good Timeline is the place where we examine the global force of transhumanism, how we as humans are transforming ourselves into something very different from our hunter-gatherer ancestors, and how we might best make that transition. It's been some time since the last chat about the emergence of purpose within selves with Jeremy Sherman. It's now 2020. The year of the rat, and I'm excited to bring consciousness researcher Gomez Emilsson back to the podcast. It's been 18 months since we last spoke, and as you'll hear, a lot has been happening at the Qualia Research Institute. Due to the dense nature of the topics, this will be a 3-part podcast. In part 1, we'll explore 5 MEO DMT, Valence Realism, the man who wants to paint the whole world yellow, Techno-Buddhism, Alpha Wave Coherence and meditation, and what that is, alongside effective altruism and long tales of pleasure and pain. Enjoy. Andres, it's a pleasure to have you back on the Good Timeline podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I wonder if we could begin and get straight into the good stuff with a Qualia Computing style trip report of the substance 5-MeO DMT.
Oh boy. Sure. So I think that's definitely a relatively recent development when it comes to kind of where I allocate my interest in terms of, what kind of experiences might be extremely important for the future of consciousness, and, where can we get like extremely good return on the investment when it comes to studying consciousness. And part of it came from kind of like doing these analyses of asking people to rate the intensity of their experiences, both in terms of just like raw energy, just like how intense it is, but also the intensity of pleasure or the intensity of suffering. And one of the things that would come up in kind of people who were experienced with a number of psychoactive substances is that pretty much everybody who had taken 5-MeO DMT would rank it at the top. and that was pretty surprising, and I really wasn't expecting it. I was kind of under the impression, you could say, that NN-DMT, kind of the classical DMT, so to speak, was perhaps one of the trippiest or most intense or most bizarre state of consciousness out there. But it really does seem to be the case that people who have tried both, even in high doses, say that 5-MeO is something else. One person actually described it as a wormhole in a bag, like something that is so unbelievably intense and outlandish that it's very hard to believe that it's actually just a chemical influencing your brain. It feels like some kind of alien technology of some sort. As usual, I kind of like distinguish between the phenomenal character of the experience, which is what the experience feels like, and how it manifests in terms of mathematical features and patterns that we can formalize, as opposed to the intentional content, which is what the experience is about. And I can definitely start with the intentional content, because that is what most people think about when you ask them to describe a psychedelic experience. They usually go about it to describing the narrative of what happened. On a typical DMT experience, they will say something like, I was taken by surprise by just like the intensity of vibration, and all of a sudden my soul went out of my body and I was taken to a spaceship and I was told secrets of the universe and stuff like that. They don't necessarily talk about, like I experienced the wallpaper symmetry group of the star 632 form followed by hyperbolic symmetries, and like that's not the typical style of trip reports, but it's something that I really push people for, to kind of like dig deeper into actually what the features of the experience were. Now, when it comes to 5-MeO DMT, the very classical intentional content that is described is one of merging with the cosmos or merging with the absolute. A lot of people talk about how they realize, quote unquote, that they are God, that we are all God, pretending to be, a universe with lots of different souls. And this profound sense of the inability to tell the differences between themselves and others, that the, quote unquote, the barrier between subject and object melts and they become like a unified blob of consciousness. And typically, if the trip was a good one, people will say something like, I got the message, the most important truth. And you kind of like bring that back down. And of course, what the most important truth is very idiosyncratic. It will depend on a person's preconceptions and pre-existing beliefs. But it's usually something along the lines of open individualism, like we're all one consciousness, paired up with some kind of a message of hope that there's so much more in the future waiting for us. Now, when it comes to the phenomenal character, I think to a large extent you can kind of reduce all of these high-level descriptions of what the experience was about in terms of what it felt like, what was the Qualia furbishing of the experience. And when you probe about that, one of the things that kind of come up right away is that very, very quickly after taking 5-MeO DMT, there seems to be a really powerful vibration that takes over, and it synchronizes all of your bodily systems somehow. That, in some sense, on other psychedelics, when you take them, you may kind of experience some clusters of your experience getting in sync. You may experience this interesting synesthesia between colors and sounds, or even just the fact that you experience visual symmetries. You can think of it as some kind of integration or phase locking of some sort. Whereas the 5-MeO DMT, the effect is so extreme that it feels like your entire experience becomes synchronized to this very powerful frequency. And it's a frequency that kind of has harmonics in the low frequencies. I mean, there's kind of like this, perhaps along the lines of 4 hertz vibration that happens throughout your body. But then on top of that, there is this much higher frequency based on some reports, especially comparing it with sound and beating patterns. People have identified it to be roughly in the 40 hertz range, perhaps a little bit higher. And in that sense, the kind of characteristic frequency of 5-MeO DMT is actually higher than the other psychedelics. When I've kind of inquired in the same way with something like phenethylamines, like 2CB, the frequency tends to be much more close to, let's say, 15, 17 hertz. LSD being more kind of 20, psilocybin being around like 25, DMT being about 30, and 5-MeO being 40. Like, it's distinctly a higher frequency type of effect.
When you say frequency, are you talking about an audible frequency, or is this a felt sort of frequency in the body? And how are these people measuring this frequency?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a synesthetic frequency that can manifest into any modality, but it's not tied to any particular modality. That said, it is very common, in particular, for example, with NN-DMT, that people will describe a very powerful sound. And if you kind of like introspect on that sound and then you play other beating patterns, the thing is, like, if you just play a 30 hertz frequency, that's actually too low. But if you play a beating pattern of 30 hertz, which you can basically generate by taking 2 different pure tones that have like a difference of 30 hertz, or like a difference of 60 hertz, because it gets halved. But if you do something like that, that's the sort of frequency effect that people describe. I mean, pretty straightforward how you can kind of do this at home. You basically, you just combine pure tones. You can generate them in MATLAB or in R.
Is the principle to to generate a tone and generate a beat frequency and then just match it to your internal experience, and then that's how they've generated these numbers?
Yeah, that's right. It's fascinating that like different states of consciousness make you, in a sense, more resonant to particular frequencies, and that's definitely something we can get into more detail as we go on the podcast. So with this technique, if you do it with a 5-MeO, it's something along like 40 hertz. And I should emphasize too that we're talking about a very generic type of frequency. Again, sound is how it can manifest. Can also manifest in flickering, and it's not that different than what you can experience with a stroboscopic stimulation. So like these flickering lights that on certain frequencies seem to produce interesting psychological visual effects. But on top of that, it's not a particular modality. It's kind of this intermediate synesthetic space. And a really good description seems to be that strange feeling that you can get on the ASMR videos. People kind of like naturally describe it as a synesthetic mixture of sound and touch. And it's an effect of that sort. It's kind of like, it's not intrinsically sound, it's not intrinsically touch. It seems to be a intermediate point between the two. Now, with 5-MeO DMT, there's kind of like, it really depends on the dosage, the intensity of the effects, but the frequency, the characteristic frequency, seems to be independent of the dose. At least that's what the reports seem to indicate. And this basically is fascinating because I've basically collected trip reports of people who have taken it at extraordinarily small doses. So just to give you an idea, a threshold noticeable dose where you realize like, oh my gosh, I'm experiencing psychedelic effects is about 1 milligram. Whereas a full ego death, you forget entirely who you are and that you have ever been a human, that's more in the 10 milligram range. However, there's some people who even at 0.1 milligrams say that they experience that state as kind of the feeling that you get after a week-long meditation retreat, that you can go into meditation very easily. You have kind of like carved the pathways in your brain so that you can easily entrain yourself into a very peaceful type of meditation with very high levels of concentration. So even though at 0.1 milligrams, there's no obvious sensory effects or no obvious vibration of any sort, there is still nonetheless this incredibly enhanced ability to meditate, which I thought was a fascinating observation. It also suggests that it might be a compound that might be uniquely fit for basically enhancing meditation or accelerating the progression of meditation. Now, at 1 milligram range, it seems to be very similar to DMT in a dose compared to approximately 5 milligrams of DMT. People describe a very small hint of visual effects that is similar to DMT, again, slightly higher frequency. And I should say also that the frequency also manifests spatially. So, of course, you can think of frequency in the time domain as, how many beats per second are you experiencing? But then in the spatial domain as well, which you can think of how many bars can you fit in your visual field, let's say from the extreme left to the extreme right. And if you have, let's say, just two bars, that would be kind of 2 bars per visual field, just to put a number on it. And you observe this general pattern then on 2CB, for example, the visual hallucinations have a certain characteristic spatial frequency that is lower than LSD, and then which is lower than psilocybin, which is lower than DMT, and then 5-MeO DMT. Meaning that on NN-DMT, the visuals are very detailed. I mean, people usually are very surprised with, the amount of detail. It feels like it's a kind of an HD version of your experience with extremely intricate and small patterns. And this also is the case with 5-MeO DMT. That said, that visual character seems to only really be dominant as part of the experience in the rather small dosages. And very quickly after that, the body sensation really takes over as the dominant feature of the experience. And I would definitely say that another characteristic difference here is that whereas regular DMT, it's extremely colorful. I mean, people, describe taking a hit of DMT and then looking at their arm, and they can see the cells and they can see the communication between the cells, and it's all very trippy, but it's all, with magentas and greens and blues and very detailed colors. In 5-MeO DMT, people describe it as, if you look at your arm, it just radiates white light. It's kind of this, pure, bright white light. It doesn't have any individual color. And I would say that as a general feature, that is very characteristic of 5-MeO DMT. And that is to say that it's unitive. That whereas usually most psychedelics kind of enhance distinctions between qualia, DMT, for example, people can say, I went to a world that was the most purple world ever. Like it was the purplest purple. And maybe that lasted for a couple seconds, and then you moved on to a yellow world, and then, a crunchy world, and then, a kale world, and all of these extremely specific, highly dense, highly specified qualia. On 5-MeO, it really moves in the opposite direction, which is the feeling of seeing all the colors at once, not focusing on any one in particular. And then the feeling of all tastes at once. And then the feeling of, all sensations, all high-level sensations at once, or being in multiple places at once. Like that seems to be a very general feature, that it unifies as opposed to differentiate.
Do you think it's actually saturated the qualia space somehow, by virtue of its energy content? Or is it simply just like monist along a number of dimensions?
It's a fascinating question. I mean, I think like one explanation could be it saturates, basically it's too much energy, that the differentiation is unstable. Things, it's kind of like you start experiencing purple, but then also blue, and then also green, and they blend onto each other. But I think there's another analogy that maybe can give you a little bit of a hint of what this is all about, which is this idea of, the analogy is with, a kid on a swing. The best place in order to push, a kid on a swing, in a sense, is kind of like right exactly when it's at the very top. It's kind of like it has like zero speed at that precise moment, and you can push it. And if you keep pushing it exactly in that moment, that's a very economical way of adding energy to the swing. And maybe a not so good way is to kind of like hit it randomly at different points in time, or maybe hit it with a frequency that is not the same as the frequency of the swing, just a little bit off.
It's called a piñata.
Yeah, something like that. Exactly like a piñata. So it's like every time you hit it, you kind of like dephase it a little bit. And well, if you could imagine, you're kind of like you're splintering off another version of the swing, and you're changing its direction constantly, and you're preventing kind of the full accumulation of energy that you could. And in this analogy, 5-MeO would be like hitting your brain harmonics exactly at their natural frequency, so that energy builds up like as efficiently as possible. Whereas regular DMT is like constantly hitting it, but slightly off. And so it keeps generating distinctions. Another completely physiological explanation might have to do with lateral inhibition. That in the cortex, basically you have this encoding of different types of qualia. You can see this on color perception. They call it the pinwheel model of color perception, where what types of color different hypercolumns encode are such that the nearby ones basically encode opposite colors. And there's this lateral inhibition taking place where whenever you stimulate a hypercolumn that represents the color blue or renders the color blue, it automatically completely inhibits the color yellow. It seems like DMT, regular DMT, really kind of like plays off of these a lot. Like it basically, everything is flip-flopping between its possible counterparts. Like yellow kind of like flip-flops into blue, which flip-flops again into yellow, or, like magenta and green, they flip-flop as well. But maybe 5-MeO, I hypothesize, maybe neurochemically it disables lateral inhibition, in which case you would be getting, blue and yellow at the same time. It's kind of this large area of activation, and it would be kind of unitive. It would make everything blend together, and that seems to be the phenomenology of the state.
Are there any other useful neurological applications, as far as we can tell, of that kind of lateral inhibition? Does it have a role in other kinds of perception?
That's a good question. I mean, it does seem to be pretty quintessential to how the brain works. Like the networks build on top of the lateral inhibition of the networks of the slightly lower hierarchy and so on. So if you were to disable that, presumably the whole system enter states that are completely unusual, completely probably very bad for survival. On the other hand, potentially really good for valence, for maximizing how good the experience feels. This definitely connects with the whole symmetry theory of valence, that in a sense the most blissful states are the absolutely most regular and invariant upon the largest number of possible transformations. And it seems that 5-MeO DMT very quickly pushes you to that region, whereas perhaps because of the lateral inhibition effect, DMT is constantly and perpetually a chaotic state. Basically, every single step along the way is, in a sense, inhibiting its counter state, and it will flip-flop into its counter state as the state evolves. So there's kind of no clear symmetrical attractor. There may be partial symmetries you encounter along the way. So valence can go up and down very chaotically, but it's not going to, find an attractor of ultimate bliss, which is much more a 5-MeO DMT type of effect.
When you see, when you try to visualize the Qualia state space of 5-MeO DMT, you're talking about a construct which, as you say, is invariant to as many things as possible. Do you see a big spherical blob, something which is totally undifferentiated, or do you imagine that as something with a bit more texture and rich symmetry?
I think a sphere is a good example. Would be probably a high-dimensional sphere. I think another good metaphor is, quite frankly, is that of high-dimensional groups. Because high-dimensional groups, in the way they're built, intrinsically have, and I'm talking about mathematical groups, they intrinsically have symmetries associated to them. It would be my wild guess that usually we have kind of a corrupted groups, in a sense, groups with missing elements, and that the information content of our experience has to do with what elements are missing. Whereas in 5-MeO DMT is kind of all of the elements become completed, and then you're just this high-dimensional group with its associated extremely high levels of symmetry. Yeah, I know that sounds extremely speculative and bizarre, but if I were to identify a mathematical object, it would probably be groups, even more than a specific, geometric shape.
So you mentioned valence.
Yes.
Which I imagine seems to be a top priority for the Qualia Research Institute and Qualia Computing. Can you explain what valence realism is, and how it relates to picking up the baton from Buddhism's goal of eliminating suffering from all sentient beings.
Yeah, for sure. So Valence Realism is saying that, how good or bad an experience feels like is, in a sense, an objective feature of the universe. You can contrast it in a sense, you can say, Valence anti-realism perhaps, but I would actually contrast it with nihilism, first of all.
Yeah.
This notion of the complete absence of any kind of objective value, that everything, all of the value systems are either entirely relative or entirely illusory. And I would also associate Valence Realism with the philosophical notion of hedonism. I mean, not hedonism in the low grade sense of go out and take a bunch of cocaine and have a fun night. I'm talking much more about hedonism in the sense of, hey, like what is good in the universe is to minimize suffering and maximize happiness in one way or another. Of course, it has a lot of caveats and qualifiers, such as, hey, how do you prioritize what types of suffering to eliminate first, and what kinds of happiness should you be pursuing? I mean, yeah, that's kind of like something that you have to build on top of Valence Realism. But as a building block, a conceptual building block, Valence Realism is kind of this reassurance that, hey, actually there is something in here that, in an informal way of speaking, is what the quote-unquote universe actually wants. That the universe actually has a utility function built into itself. And that what we do on a day-to-day basis is some kind of noisy, grainy reflection of, what the universe truly wants, except that we are, doing it from such a specific point of view and trapped in these Rube Goldberg machines created by evolution for us to do useful work for reproduction and survival, that we don't necessarily realize that, in a sense, this is, connected to something very, very deep and ontological. And it does have like this, unusual implication that if you were to kind of actually follow step by step ways of improving your experience, you may end up in extremely outlandish places like a 5-MEO DMT state or a Buddhist jhana or something like that, that really doesn't resemble any Darwinian type experience.
No, unless you're of like the stoned ape hypothesis, bent.
Right.
It's interesting using the words that the universe might want this and that it's a utility function. Does that suggest that the universe would have some sort of agency and sort of self-awareness, or would it suggest some other kind of unembodied wanting or
The word that you're looking for, I believe, is teleology.
That's
telos,
exactly.
Final drive, inherent vector.
Yeah, exactly. I think it would be more comfortable with telos describing this as opposed to agency or self-awareness, because, I mean, interestingly, within Valence Realism, you could, in a sense, deconstruct agency as, again, these complex Rube Goldberg machines of lots of little microstates and networks of, little valence gradients that, on the whole, act as a, fully functioning rational agent of some sort, or something that seems to have, high-level desires, want things, want to interact with the world, and so on. But it's all fundamentally constructed from this much, much, much more basic kind of universal gradient of want or like what is it that, the fundamental fields that make up reality, what states do they prefer to be in?
And that makes sense if you look at life's sort of tendency to be negentropic and life seeming wanting to live.
I mean, I might push back a little bit on that, because
good.
I mean, I think like the, wanting to live, again, I would say that's a very high level desire. And you definitely, in some cases, like it might be adaptive to want to die. And like, at least at the cellular level, right, like apoptosis, if cells happen to be conscious, like it could very well be that they experience an intense urge, to destroy themselves, in a efficient and reuse in a way that maximizes the reusability of their molecules and so on. But you could probably implement a whole range of completely outlandish behaviors that are still fundamentally based on, following the valence gradient. It's just like the fact that is usually used for, preserving negentropy as much as possible is an adaptation for obvious reasons by evolution. But in a crazy scientist lab, you could make an organism that all it wants is to look at the color blue, and it doesn't care about whether it lives or dies or yeah. I actually met a person once, quite intelligent, but also very, very, very autistic, whose entire life purpose was to make the world as yellow as possible. And that really dumbfounded me.
Wow.
Yeah. This is a guy who actually had got a bronze medal in the International Math Olympiads, and like was a really clever guy technically, but then
did he try to take long-term strategic action towards this goal, or was he content with merely splashing things around occasionally?
Scarily, he was very strategic about it.
Wow.
Yeah, well, this definitely touches a little bit on kind of AI security, because in a sense, this guy had as many other intelligences that might want something pretty arbitrary. He had as a sub-goal to become the king of the world, so that then he could command people to paint the world as yellow as possible, as efficiently as possible. So his strategy was actually to become mega rich first.
So in like the AI alignment literature, I guess that's like a point both for and against, like for containing totally arbitrary drives, but B, those drives ultimately resolving to like, the survival drives, the Omohundro drives.
Right. That at least within some windows of time, if the intelligence is not too pressured in time, they will, generally speaking, converge towards a set of pretty valuable, universally valuable, like assets. Get them first.
Yeah. How's it going with his goals?
I haven't kept up with him. I hope he's not too far ahead in them.
We will find out when the world becomes really yellow, I suppose.
Oh yeah, I'll be watching that. Okay, so on the point of the
turmeric everywhere.
On the point of nature using valence as like our internal like carrot and stick, I'm sure everyone has like a pretty decent picture in their minds of the time they spent playing The Sims, because pretty much everyone did that at one point. You can practically see like, those drives in ourselves or in the people around us. We've just got a bunch of meters, and one of them is labeled like bladder level.
Yeah.
One's like
yellow level, yellowing of the world level.
We're all just playing them off all the time.
Yeah, for sure. James, I think you've got a question relating to valence and Buddhism.
Well, yeah, because Andres, you would have had the opportunity to talk to a lot of people, I expect, in Buddhist or Buddhist-influenced spaces, religions. What has been your experience when, shilling them on Qualia Research and Valence Realism and Paradise Engineering?
It really depends on how dogmatic they are. And I think that might be to some extent, upbringing and how they got acquainted with Buddhism. Also, it might be a personality trait to some extent. I've encountered some very open-minded Buddhists who basically say, like, if you can show me, long-term valence-enhancing technologies that get rid of dukkha in a more effective way than the Eightfold Path, then I'm all for it. And in my experience, that's like relatively common. I would say maybe one in three smart Buddhists eventually converges to something along those lines. But there is definitely a kind of like a hardcore, more dogmatic part of the Buddhist population I've encountered who, they cling to the rites and rituals that they have learned to have passed the test of time, and also they tend to be in that type of case, they tend to be very concerned about the possible side effects. I mean, definitely, if you're a utilitarian, but you have classic Buddhist metaphysics, and you actually believe in reincarnation, you actually believe in some type of karma that is unavoidable. They might say something like, well, if you modify your brain to increase your valence, eliminate suffering genetically or something like that, you're basically just blocking away kind of these bunches and bunches of negative karma that you have still laying around and still waiting for you. You're just kind of like pushing aside the task, and eventually it's gonna cut up to you, and you're gonna have a really bad time. Plus, you're straying people away from the path of actual realization and kind of seducing them with sensory pleasures. And I've definitely heard that line of reasoning. However, I think like the crux of the matter does come down to things such as, is the phenomenology of awakening and the neurological processes of awakening something that resembles, for example, the 5-MeO DMT state? And based on a bunch of research that can also lay out some of these findings, I would say that, actually, like the place towards which Buddhist nirvana is attempting to guide our nervous system towards has a tremendous amount of overlap with extremely ecstatic states of consciousness on especially 5-MeO DMT, but also temporal lobe epilepsy and other unusual ways of modifying your brain state. And if we can show that empirically, I think that might go very far in basically convincing a lot of people who currently might be on the more dogmatic side of the equation. I do tend to emphasize that, all of the evidence shows that Buddha was really a pragmatist. He would go from town to town and basically modify his speech so that it would kind of resonate as much as possible with the pre-existing beliefs and attachments of the people he was trying to help. Like it doesn't seem that he, would refuse to help somebody if they had a particular type of delusion, or if they thought like a particular type of meditation was the way. He would perhaps nudge them in a way. And in that sense, I think you could even kind of reinterpret Buddha and his, the Eightfold Path and all of these fascinating consciousness technologies of ancient times as themselves just, what was pragmatically available at the time. And my really strong guess is that if Buddha was alive today, he would be looking at neuroscience and things like 5-MeO DMT and trying to measure awakening and valence and genetic engineering. Like I don't think he would leave those options off the table, given his pragmatism.
Yeah, sure. On that note, I saw in one of your talks that you spoke about monks that have trained for 20 plus years to successfully deprogram evolutionary suffering mechanisms. And you said a similar program might be achieved within a month with 5-MeO DMT. Could you go into a little more detail on what the state actually is that these monks are in and why it could be achieved so quickly with 5-MeO DMT? Yeah,
so this, I definitely have a lot of phenomenological intuitions for this, but just looking at hard science, here's what we know. Basically, there is a general convergence on the type of effect that a wide variety of types of meditation, have on the way your brain behaves. And that is, in particular, they tend to increase gamma power of your brain. And also, in particular, they tend to increase gamma coherence. That is basically how much phase locking there is between the different channels of an EEG in the gamma frequency range. We're talking about, vipassana, mindfulness, concentration meditation, meta meditation, they all seem to have that as one of the characteristic effects. Now, they definitely also have additional effects that are different depending on the type of meditation. For example, vipassana seems to also increase the alpha frequency band, I believe, like between like 8 and 12 hertz. Basically, the resting state of people who do a lot of vipassana, their alpha power is slightly higher. Mindfulness also increases, I believe, like between 12 and 15 hertz. So there's like slight differences. Oh, and concentration meditation seems to increase theta, kind of like this deep state of, relaxation, almost kind of like being asleep while being awake sort of thing. But I would say those are like flavors in a sense. They're like ways in which the experience may differ in some important but not essential way. Whereas the gamma power and coherence enhancement might be really the trick when it comes to diminishing dukkha, because you have, in a sense, this source of valence, this positive feeling that doesn't seem to be conditioned on other things that tend to arise that usually would interact with other frequency bands. And what we've seen based on some data set that was donated to us of somebody who did 5-MeO DMT in Mexico, where, by the way, it's unscheduled, so that data set it didn't break the law or anything, and the person was happy to allow us to analyze it. And lo and behold, what we found was 5-MeO DMT seems to massively increase gamma power and especially gamma coherence to an extraordinary extent. It also has these other classic psychedelic effects like reducing alpha and beta power, which is pretty common of all psychedelics, while also increasing theta power and theta coherence probably also matters. But the point is, like, the thing that seems to be the quintessential positive effect of meditation, the thing that accumulates year after year, the more meditation you do, is exactly the thing that 5-MeO DMT seems to do really, really, really effectively and pretty much instantly. So that's kind of like, I think like a hard science educated guess for why perhaps microdosing 5-MeO DMT during a retreat may basically allow you to, develop the same level of brain entrainment to gamma coherent patterns as you might over many years. So I think that avenue is promising.
It sounds like we're actually ready to begin a new era of really easy entrainment, really easy, development of these states.
I should say that actually for Qualia Research, and we can get into much more detail now or later, but the two main research programs that we're going to be focusing on in 2020 is, on the one hand, collecting a high quality data set of neuroimaging of extremely high valence states, of ideally as many different types as possible. Definitely 5-MeO DMT, definitely Jhanas, these like highly concentrated states, hopefully temporal lobe epilepsy, hopefully MDMA, and we will hopefully be able to show that all of them basically share the property of very low dissonance relative to the overall power across the connectum-specific harmonic waves, which would validate the symmetry theory of valence. Of course, if the symmetry theory of valence is not doesn't hold up with that data set, that's not the end. It just means we need to work harder to figure out actually what is the necessary and sufficient conditions for extremely high valence states. And one of the things that we are predicting is that, in a sense, like the coherence of the gamma frequency band is not exactly all that you need. There's also a little bit more, which is that you should also not have dissonance between those channels. And here is definitely a very tricky subject and important to touch upon, which is that on a certain percentage of people who take 5-MeO DMT, they have extremely unpleasant experiences. I mean, we were talking about like really, really bad. I mean, like really reaching kind of the heights of how terrible an experience can be, which in a sense is largely a reason why I would not recommend to most people to try a high dose 5-MeO DMT experience, by all means, go to Mexico and try a microdose and see how that affects you, before actually taking a large dose. I definitely don't advocate going with a shaman who says like, oh, you have to take a breakthrough dose for it to be worth it or anything. I think that's dangerous and unethical.
Well, just as a practical point, do you think that microdoses would be predictive? Could you actually use that information, do you think, to be easily predictive of adverse experiences?
I strongly suspect so. More so, there's like two additional key factors, which is your pre-existing state. It does seem to be the case that if you're in an anxious, agitated state to begin with, the chances of a bad 5-MeO DMT trip just like skyrocket. Whereas if you've been meditating for several hours and you're listening to very calm music, or I've actually read a bunch of reports of people who were taking 5-MeO while on MDMA, and that seems to basically drastically increase the probability of a really good experience. But yeah, in addition to that, definitely the lower doses are probably predictive of whether the experience is going to be good or bad. I will add as well that another key factor seems to be the rate of administration. So like if you take a very large hit, if you're vaporizing it and you take a very large hit, the suddenness of the increase of the energy usually will lead to a panic attack. And, a panic attack becomes amplified by the intensity of that state. So what seems to be kind of the more responsible way of actually taking 5-MeO is to titrate over the course of about like 5 minutes. Continue to take small amounts until you build up to the level that you feel the highest level you feel comfortable with. And I think that is also one of the safest ways of taking it.
Can you speak a bit about effective altruism and the long tails of pleasure and pain? And it might help to define both the movement and what is meant by long tail.
Yeah. So effective altruism is, both a intellectual and social movement that seeks to use logic, reason, and data in order to be able to maximize the altruistic bang for your buck, so to speak. And for those who don't know it, some of the classic kind of discoveries within the field involve things such as donating money to charities like Against Malaria Foundation, where they basically distribute these mosquito nets laced with the insecticide in order to prevent people from getting malaria. And it turns out that is, hundreds of times more cost effective to actually go out there and prevent cases of malaria as opposed to try to cure cases of malaria. And the difference is huge. Another super classic example is with the amount of money that you require in order to train a guide dog for somebody who is blind, you can quite literally cure the blindness of 40 people in developing countries.
Wow.
And it's like, okay, that's the trade-off there is very obviously lopsided. Even if you are a fan of dogs and you think it's cute to have a guide dog, it's just quite nonsensical from the point of view of reducing suffering, improving the quality of life. And when they've done this analysis, they take, let's say, 1,000 charities and they kind of do due diligence. They see, okay, how many quality adjusted life years are we saving per each dollar donated to each of these different charities? You will see that it looks extremely skewed. So skewed, in fact, that 80% of the value seems to come from just 20% of charities, if you were to allocate money equally among all of them. And this in statistics is usually referred to as a long tail. And there's many different types of long tails. The most well-known one is power laws, but there's also log normal distributions, and there's a bunch. There's a family of them. In effective altruism, they have found that your activities in different with different focus seem to follow a kind of pretty skewed long tail of how much good you can produce in the world. That said, how you derive these fundamentally assumes a particular metric that you're trying to maximize. And the classic metrics that in effective altruism they're trying to maximize are things such as quality adjusted life years, which is basically how many years of life were you able to save, in a sense, by saving the life of somebody who's younger. In a sense, you're saving more life years than saving the life of somebody who's older, but also by prioritizing kind of people who they were in a bad health state. So not only would they perhaps like live fewer years, but also the quality of life would be lower. If you can flip them into a healthy state, you're in a sense getting kind of like double of the benefit because you're improving the number of years that they will live and also the quality of them. So that's one of very classic metric. But there's other ones. There's definitely people who focus, for example, on expected probability reduction of catastrophic risk. And they might define catastrophic risk as more than 1 billion people die on Earth. Or they may, for example, try to optimize expected survival time of humanity. A lot of people who are in X risks or AI safety, that's kind of the metric that they're interested in. And definitely things such as how many factory farm animals will you prevent from suffering? Basically, how many pigs are you preventing from being born and living a terrible life in factory farming situations? And I mean, I think as a whole, I think this is fantastic. I mean, this is kind of like way, above and beyond what was in charity just like a short 15 years ago. Nobody was thinking in this way. I mean, maybe a few economists in some economics departments in universities, but not as a movement, not as a concerted effort of smart people trying to help the world. The key contribution of the Qualia Research Institute to this entire field for the time being is to point at the fact that there are long tails also in the intensity of suffering as well as the intensity of happiness. But I mean, let's focus on suffering first because it's the most pressing issue, which is something, I mean, quite honestly, is very scary and depressing once you internalize it. On the other hand, if you don't reason about this, you are very likely to do relatively inefficient allocation of resources because you might be missing out on what matters the most. So that's why, even though I don't like to think about it, I'm sure I'm not doing any favor to the psychological health of people who kind of internalize what I'm saying. I do think it's our ethical duty to actually reason about this very clearly. And thanks to a literature review I did this year, together with a small pilot study that we ran, we basically build up what I think is a super strong case that kind of the suffering that they say each person on a given day experiences follows a power law, or most likely a log normal distribution, but basically a super long tail where, the top 0.1% of the people who are suffering the most, maybe accounting for like 50% of the suffering that is happening. And the sources of suffering are very, very non-traditional type of things. I mean, most people, when you ask them, okay, what is causing the most suffering in the world? They will say things such as war, or they may say things such as like inequality, poverty, or the inability to move in classes in society, or, for example, the lack of democracy in a country. Or there's like a lot of things with that flavor that people surface as kind of the most pressing issues. But if you do this analysis and you take seriously the long tails of suffering, the things that come up is cluster headaches, these particularly awful type of headaches, that 1 in 1,000 people have. Other things are like kidney stones and migraines and Crohn's disease and gallstones. There's a family of like 10 or so diseases that are, potentially thousands of times more painful and horrible than than people intuitively believe. And I think there's like a tremendous amount of biases that prevent us from seeing these clearly. So this is one of the hills I'm willing to die on, so to speak.
Yeah, it was quite interesting because in the article that you posted, you had the SCAR, I think Christopher SCAR. There was another one or the Schmidt Pain Scale. It was a guy who'd stung himself with every stinging insect imaginable and then rated it on a scale of 1 to 4. I think bullet ant was the most intensely painful insect.
His scale, by his own description, was logarithmic.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's definitely one of the pieces of evidence that builds up the case, that he was saying how, the difference between a bee sting and a harvester ant sting is tenfold. Basically, 10 bee stings at once are as painful as a harvester ant, and then 10 harvester ants are as painful as a bullet ant. Yeah, there's a number of I think like bullet ant, warrior ant, and I forget the third one, but you said like he stung himself with every conceivable insect. That's actually not quite true. He stung himself with every insect of the Hymenoptera order, which includes ants and bees and wasps. But there are other insects as well, and there are things that are actually more painful than bullet ants, unfortunately.
Box jellyfish, man of war, all that kind of stuff.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I actually was playing around with this is impractical, and I would get so much pushback for these that I don't think it's worth it. But it's interesting to consider that an effective altruist cause might be to, identify the absolutely most painful insect bites that are not well known, and then go and make those species extinct. Yeah, so that they can't, be used for torture. They can't. You just kind of like remove that potential hazard from planet Earth. That sounds very, very bad, but I think I do think it would be a good idea.
And then on the other end of these long tails, you have pleasure, right? So I think in one of the posts you said something about the one person at the party who's having the best time might be having a way better time than most of the people at the party put together.
Yeah, a comment on the party. It's almost kind of the movies. We complain about the movies that show a party because they usually just focus on the main character, and everybody else is a walk-on character, like they play a beat part. But I think that's kind of true. There's probably one person in the party who is the most high on psychedelics, and the bulk of consciousness is happening on that person. And everything else is just a side plot.
We've all seen that guy at the party.
Yeah. That guy who's either having a blast or having a bad trip, and then like it's actually the main thing that's going on.
Yeah, that's the inverse.
Yeah. The three quintessential examples are 5-MeO DMT, temporal lobe seizures, and Jhana meditation, which is these extremely advanced concentration states. And there are 8 of them, and they increase in their subtlety of the bliss. People who really know about it, they say like, well, on the lower jhanas, there is kind of these quote unquote gross, and by that is kind of like coarse, this coarse quality of happiness, almost actually kind of sexual. A lot of people describe jhana number 1, for example, as continuous multiple orgasms, whereas jhanas 2, like the second jhana, is already a little bit more psychological. Somebody described it as coming down to the Christmas tree on December 25th and having a bunch of presents and opening the present, and it's exactly what you wanted, and you have been wishing it for the entire year, and like just capture that feeling of joy and then just have it continuously for hours. And that's just like jhana number 2, and it gets increasingly difficult to relate to humans as you go up because they are more abstract. Basically, jhanas 5 and above are what they call formless jhanas, which is the object of concentration is in fact not something that has kind of this single-pointed attention quality of your focus is in a particular place. It's more kind of this distributed, almost non-local feeling of absorption. So jhana number 5 is absorption into space. Some people describe it as infinite space, but others, I believe like Daniel Ingram, for example, they actually describe it more as boundless space. And actually, I think that makes a lot more sense, that basically you're creating a phenomenal space without internal boundaries. It's almost like if usually you are a kind of like surface with edges and your attention kind of bounces off the edges and there's a little bit of dukkha associated with that, going into the 5th jhana might be kind of like seamlessly connecting the edges to create a torus, for example, or a sphere, so that the attention lines just never have to end on any corner. They just continue, moving freely. And in that sense, yeah, the description of a boundless space makes sense. Then, people describe it as attention kind of turns on itself rather than focusing on space. You focus on attention itself. So people describe it as infinite consciousness or boundless consciousness. It's kind of this very intense sensation of awakening or self-awareness. Jhana number 7 is concentration on nothing. Basically, the sensation of just no intentional content at all. Again, I don't actually think this means you don't exist. There's clearly energy and consciousness. It's just that the attention field lines don't converge anywhere. So basically, there's no way for you to grasp any object of attention. Your attention just kind of seamlessly continues in circles. And then the 8th jhana is this other state that is described as neither being nor non-being, or neither something nor something. Sorry, neither something nor nothing. Very paradoxical state, but apparently experientially discernible from the 7th. And I would say also, all of that progression of phenomenology is very much present on 5-MeO DMT states as well. I would also point out, this is, to me, one of kind of the most telling pieces of evidence for something like the symmetry theory of valence, is that as you're moving up in the jhanas, and as you're moving up on DMT, 5-MeO DMT levels, the information content of your experience continues to drop, right? Like, the jhanas 1 through 4, there's still information content in the sense of there is a specific object of attention, which is a bodily sensation of pleasure, or a bodily sensation of joy, or psychological pleasure. It still has a form to it, has a specificity to it. But as you go up, space still has information. It has geometry, that is in some sense differentiation. But, by the time you get to nothing, that's kind of just one state. And by the time you get to neither nothing nor something, that is probably zero information. That is like as little information as you can possibly have, right? If they say like, what does your cat look like? And you say, oh, it's neither something nor nothing, or like it's either something or nothing. You're not really saying anything, right?
It's a bit like the superposition.
Yeah. It's zero ontology.
Yeah.
That's definitely a topic to also touch upon. But yeah, it's like close to zero information as possible. And 5-MeO DMT seems to do the same. And from the point of view of the symmetry theory of valence, that essentially means any transformation you apply to the state returns the exact same state, meaning it's as symmetrical as it can possibly be. And therefore, in that theory, it is as blissful as it can possibly be.
Just to sum up, so from an effective altruist standpoint, Qualia Research Institute's goal along this lines would be to maximize the amount of highly blissful states that are available, while at the same time reducing the highly adverse states as much as possible. because the long tails have the most effect there.
That's right. There is definitely some subtleties here on two fronts, actually. I mean, first of all, yes, I would say the program is threefold. I mean, we want to eliminate bad extremes, then increase baseline.
Yeah.
And that matters actually for functionality. I mean, to be able to be productive and functional and intelligent and smart and free, high levels of agency. And the third kind of branch is increase and achieve new heights. Increase the states of extreme well-being and achieve new heights. An interesting subtlety here, though, is that when you kind of approximate zero information at the limit, it's very interesting because there might be two things that are happening at once. I mean, on the one hand, you are maximizing valence. On the other hand, you may be minimizing consciousness. So
True.
if you actually achieve that, you may have achieved zero, because it's like zero consciousness times infinite valence, but that's still zero, or extremely high valence. So it could very well be that to maximize absolute amount of valence, which would be kind of the valence quality multiplied by the amount of consciousness, that the place to hit may actually not be the 8th jhana state. It might be something else. It might be something in between, probably still pretty high up, but just not the absolute peak, because that would be also to have zero consciousness.
Very quickly on the subject of the psychedelic states, DMT, I mean, I would describe as having a extremely high raw intensity of experience. How do you think that 5-MeO compares to that?
Oh, it's the same. Yeah. Extremely high intensity of experience and even more so than DMT. That said, and this relates to exactly what I was saying just before, there is this phenomena of whiteouts. I mean, if you take enough 5-MeO DMT, anything, I think above 10 milligrams, is literally impossible to remember anything about it. And in a sense, you may have become unconscious. I mean, kind of extremely deep sleep in a sense. Hey, yes, this is a perfectly symmetrical state, but it doesn't actually have consciousness. It's maximizing valence, but not consciousness. But in the way to get there, yeah, you do experience extraordinarily high levels of consciousness. Again, because of the long tail nature of these, I would say not only a fraction more than regular DMT, but it quite possibly might be orders of magnitude more.
Would there be a way to measure that with fMRI or something to determine whether it's a lack of consciousness or just a lack of encoding memory?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it definitely hinges on how accurate we can detect things such as the connectum-specific harmonic waves. But the prediction would be that basically on, let's say, high doses, but not ultra high doses, fairly high doses of 5-MeO DMT, you will see a very high amplitude, kind of the power of the harmonics of your brain will be very high, meaning that there is a lot of energy to that state. And it could be that on extremely high doses, it flattens out due to kind of this, geometric effect. If you align everything together, the harmonics can't build on top of each other, which might show up as close to no activity in a sense. Now, it could very well be that it's the opposite, that actually you are even more intensely conscious, but it's just completely impossible to remember, and a failure of encoding, as you pointed out.
This brings part 1 to a close. Keep an eye out for part 2 and part 3 of our interview with Andres Gomez Emilsson of the Qualia Research Institute. Hello there. If you've got this far, you have an exquisitely good attention span and very good taste in podcasts. And if you'd like to see the Good Timeline grow, there's a few things you could do to help. One of them would be giving us a high rating on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any other number of podcast aggregators that exist now. the other way to help is simply by word of mouth. If you know somebody that you think would enjoy this episode or any of the other episodes from the Good Timeline, feel free to share it, and that would help immensely. Much love from me here in sunny New Zealand, and I'll see you all very soon.